The year was 1891 when Elijah Suttles first claimed a stretch of land in what would become known as Rottwood Hollow. The name itself would prove prophetic, though no one could have known it then. Ezra was a hard man, forged by the cruelties of post-Civil War Appalachia. He had lost 2 brothers in the conflict and emerged from those years with a deep, burning distrust of outsiders. "Family is all that matters," he would tell his children. "Family is all we can trust." He married a woman named Hester, a distant cousin from a neighboring county. In those days, such unions were not uncommon in the isolated mountain communities. The roads were treacherous, the distances vast, and families often found partners among those they already knew. Together, Ezra and Hester had 7 children, 4 boys and 3 girls. They built a homestead on 40 acres of rocky land, carving out a life through sheer determination. But as the children grew, Ezra made a decision that would echo through the decades to come. "No child of mine will marry an outsider," he declared. "The Suttles' blood will remain pure." And so it began. The first union between cousins occurred in 1912. Ezra's eldest son, Jacob, married his first cousin, Martha. The family saw nothing wrong with this arrangement. After all, they reasoned, it kept the land in the family, it kept the bloodline strong. But nature has its own laws, and those laws cannot be broken without consequence. Jacob and Martha's first child, born in 1913, lived only 3 days. The infant came into the world with a malformed heart, a defect that would appear again and again in subsequent generations. They buried the child in a small plot behind the homestead, unmarked and unnamed. "God's will," Ezra declared. "We try again." And try they did. Over the next 15 years, Jacob and Martha would have 11 children. Only 6 survived to adulthood. The others succumbed to various ailments, mysterious weaknesses that the family attributed to bad luck, to harsh winters, to the will of the Almighty. They never considered that the cause might lie within their own lineage. By 1925, the pattern was set. The 6 surviving children of Jacob and Martha had grown, and following the mandate established by their grandfather Ezra, they too married within the family. Brother to cousin, sister to nephew. The family tree of the Suttles had become something grotesque, a tangled web where the same names appeared again and again, where the branches curved back upon themselves until they formed a closed loop from which there was no escape. The physical manifestations began to appear in the 3rd generation, children born with hands that curved inward, fingers fused together at the joints, eyes that wandered in different directions, unable to focus, jaws that jutted forward or receded so severely that eating became a daily struggle. These were the visible signs, the ones that could not be hidden. But there were other symptoms, ones that the family guarded even more closely, mental faculties that developed slowly or not at all, violent outbursts that seemed to come from nowhere, a peculiar gait that the locals came to recognize as the Suttles shuffle, a way of walking that betrayed the skeletal abnormalities hidden beneath their clothing. The people of the surrounding communities began to avoid Rottwood Hollow. Rumors spread through the mountain towns like wildfire. The Suttles were cursed, they said, touched by something dark. Children were warned never to venture near the hollow, and when a Suttles was spotted in town, purchasing supplies or selling the meager produce from their rocky farm, people would cross to the other side of the street. The family retreated further into isolation, and the isolation only accelerated their decline. By 1938, 3 generations of Suttles lived together on that 40-acre plot. Approximately 47 individuals, though the exact number was difficult to determine. Some of the children were hidden away, kept in back rooms and root cellars, their existence known only to immediate family members. These were the ones deemed too damaged to be seen, too broken to participate in even the limited interactions the family had with the outside world. One such child was Elijah Suttles, born in 1932 to parents who were both his first cousins and his aunt and uncle simultaneously. The family relationships had become so convoluted that standard terminology no longer applied. Elijah came into the world with a condition that would later be identified as a severe form of microcephaly, his skull abnormally small, his cognitive development profoundly impaired. But Elijah also possessed something that set him apart from his siblings and cousins, his hands. Elijah's hands were large, disproportionately so for his small frame, and they were strong. Despite his mental limitations, Elijah could grip with a force that astonished even the hardened men of his family. But those hands were also twisted, the fingers bent at unnatural angles, the joints swollen and misshapen. The hands that carried rot, his grandmother Martha would whisper, watching the boy struggle to hold a spoon or grasp a tool. She never explained what she meant by those words, but she would repeat them often, her eyes distant, as if seeing something beyond the present moment. It was a prophecy that would prove devastatingly accurate. Check now if you are already subscribed to this channel. If not, you are about to miss one of the most disturbing stories ever told about what happens when a family refuses to let fresh life into its lineage. Subscribe now, because what comes next will haunt you. In the spring of 1952, a young physician named Dr. Harold Brennan arrived in Hazard, Kentucky, to establish a small medical practice. Fresh from his residency in Louisville, Dr. Brennan had idealistic notions about bringing modern medicine to the underserved communities of Appalachia. He had no idea what awaited him. Within his first month of practice, Dr. Brennan began to notice something peculiar. Patients would arrive at his clinic with conditions that seemed out of place, ailments that were exceedingly rare in the general population, but appeared with alarming frequency in this remote corner of Kentucky. Children with cleft palates and clubbed feet, adults with degenerative joint conditions that left them crippled before the age of 30, cognitive impairments that ranged from mild learning difficulties to profound developmental disabilities. When Dr. Brennan inquired about family histories, he encountered a wall of silence. The mountain people were suspicious of outsiders, particularly those who asked too many questions. But the young doctor was persistent, and slowly, over months of patient care and careful relationship building, the truth began to emerge. The name Suttles came up again and again. In July of 1952, Dr. Brennan received a summons that would change the course of his career. A messenger arrived at his clinic, a gaunt young man with the telltale signs of the condition the doctor had come to recognize. The boy's jaw protruded severely, and his eyes were set too close together. He spoke with difficulty, his words slurred and halting. "Ma says you should come," the boy managed. "There's been an accident." Dr. Brennan gathered his medical bag and followed the boy into the mountains. The journey took nearly 3 hours on foot, along paths that could barely be called trails. As they climbed higher into the hollows, the vegetation grew thicker, the light dimmer, until it seemed they had passed into another world entirely. And then they arrived at Rottwood Hollow. The sight that greeted Dr. Brennan would remain with him for the rest of his life. A cluster of ramshackle structures, more hovels than houses, arranged in a rough semicircle around a central clearing. Chickens and hogs wandered freely between the buildings, their droppings mixing with the mud to create a fetid carpet that covered everything. But it was the people who truly shocked him. Approximately 24 individuals had gathered in the clearing, and among them, Dr. Brennan could identify perhaps 4 distinct physical types, repeated again and again with minor variations. It was as if he were looking at a handful of original templates that had been copied imperfectly, each reproduction introducing new errors while retaining the fundamental flaws of the originals. An elderly woman approached him. She was bent nearly double with scoliosis, her spine curved so severely that she had to crane her neck at an unnatural angle to look up at him. This was Opal Suttles, the matriarch of the family, since the death of her mother Martha 3 years prior. "The boy's hurt bad," Opal said, her voice surprisingly clear despite her physical condition. "Fell from the loft. His arm's gone wrong." She led Dr. Brennan to one of the larger structures, and there, lying on a straw-filled mattress, was Elijah Suttles. Elijah was 20 years old, though his small stature and underdeveloped features made him appear much younger. His left arm was bent at an impossible angle, the bone clearly fractured in multiple places, but what drew Dr. Brennan's attention were the young man's hands. Those hands, large, powerful, grotesquely misshapen. The fingers twisted like the roots of an old tree, the knuckles swollen and inflamed. And yet, even in his pain, Elijah gripped the edge of the mattress with a strength that whitened his already pale knuckles. "Doctor." Brennan set the broken arm as best he could, fashioning a splint from available materials. But his mind was racing with questions that went far beyond the immediate injury. "How long has he been like this?" he asked Opal, gesturing toward Elijah's hands. "Were they always this way?" Opal's face hardened. He was born with them hands. All the Suttles got something. Some got the hands, some got the jaw, some got the thinking problems. It's just how we are. "But why?" Dr. Brennan pressed. "Has anyone ever explained to you why this happens?" The old woman's eyes narrowed. "God's will," she said, echoing the words that Ezra Suttles had spoken 40 years before. "We don't question God's will." But Dr. Brennan was a man of science, and he knew that what he was witnessing had nothing to do with divine punishment or cosmic fate. He was looking at the results of generations of close family unions, of recessive genes meeting recessive genes until the hidden flaws in the human genome had nowhere left to hide. Over the following months, Dr. Brennan returned to Rottwood Hollow many times. He documented what he observed, filling notebooks with detailed descriptions and crude sketches. He counted the family members, attempting to construct a family tree that would illustrate the tangled relationships that bound them together. What he discovered was staggering. In the 60 years since Ezra Suttles had established his homestead, the family had produced approximately 130 children. Of these, fewer than half had survived to adulthood. And of those who survived, virtually all showed some manifestation of the conditions that Dr. Brennan had come to associate with the Suttles lineage. The average coefficient of relatedness within the family, he estimated, was approaching that of siblings, parents and children, brothers and sisters. The genetic diversity that allows human populations to thrive had been systematically eliminated, generation by generation, until what remained was a population so inbred that each new birth was essentially a gamble against increasingly unfavorable odds. Dr. Brennan wrote letters to colleagues at the University of Kentucky describing what he had found. He requested assistance, resources, anything that might help him understand and perhaps address the tragedy unfolding in Rottwood Hollow. The responses he received were discouraging. In the 1950s, the science of genetics was still in its infancy. The structure of the double helix had only been discovered in 1953, and the mechanisms of heredity were poorly understood. More importantly, there was little appetite among the medical establishment for involving themselves in the affairs of isolated mountain communities, whose practices, while troubling, were not technically illegal. Dr. Brennan was on his own, and so he continued his visits, providing what medical care he could, documenting what he observed, and watching helplessly as the Suttles family continued its long, slow descent into biological collapse. By 1965, Elijah Suttles had become something of a figure within Rottwood Hollow. Despite his cognitive limitations and his twisted hands, he had assumed a role that no one else in the family could fill. He was the one who handled the deceased. In a community as isolated and as afflicted as the Suttles, mortality was a constant companion. Children died in infancy. Adults succumbed to ailments that would have been treatable in the outside world. The elderly simply faded away, their bodies giving out after decades of malnutrition and neglect. And when they died, it was Elijah who prepared them for burial. No one else in the family would do it. There was a superstition among the Suttles that touching the deceased was dangerous, that the corruption of the flesh could somehow transfer to the living. But Elijah, with his strong hands and his simple mind, seemed immune to such fears. He would wash the bodies, dress them in their best clothes, and carry them to the family cemetery, a plot of ground on the hillside above the hollow where generations of Suttles lay in unmarked graves. The hands that carried rot, Opal had said all those years ago. Now the prophecy had found its fulfillment, but something was happening to Elijah. Dr. Brennan noticed it during his visits in the mid-1960s. The young man's hands, always misshapen, were deteriorating further. The joints had become so inflamed that movement was clearly painful. The skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and there were sores that refused to heal. Dr. Brennan suspected a form of arthritis, perhaps compounded by the repetitive strain of Elijah's grim duties, but without access to proper diagnostic equipment, he could only guess at the underlying cause. What he did not know, could not have known with the medical technology of the era, was that Elijah was suffering from a rare autoimmune condition, one of the many gifts that generations of inbreeding had bestowed upon him. His own body was attacking itself, mistaking healthy tissue for foreign invaders. The hands that had carried so many of his relatives to their final rest were slowly being destroyed from within. In the spring of 1967, Dr. Brennan received word that would mark the beginning of the end for the Suttles family. A representative from the state government had arrived in Hazard. There were concerns, he explained, about a community in the mountains. Reports had filtered out, rumors of children being kept in conditions unfit for human habitation, of individuals who had never been registered with any government agency, of practices that violated the basic norms of civilized society. An investigation was being launched. Dr. Brennan accompanied the state officials to Rottwood Hollow. What they found there shocked even the hardened bureaucrats who had seen poverty and neglect in many forms. The main house had partially collapsed, and the family had crowded into the remaining structures. Approximately 35 individuals were living in conditions that defied description. There was no running water, no electricity, no sanitation of any kind. The younger children were malnourished, their bellies distended, their eyes dull with hunger. The older members of the family showed the accumulated effects of decades of untreated medical conditions. And then there were the hidden ones. In a root cellar behind the main house, the officials discovered 3 individuals who had been concealed from the outside world their entire lives. They ranged in age from approximately 15 to 30 years old, though their developmental delays made accurate assessment difficult. They had been kept in the darkness, fed scraps through a small opening in the cellar door, their existence known only to the family members who had been assigned to care for them. The reasons for their concealment were immediately apparent. Even among the Suttles, these 3 represented the extreme end of the spectrum of abnormalities that inbreeding had produced. Their physical deformities were profound, their cognitive impairments severe. The family had judged them unfit to be seen by the outside world, and so they had been hidden away, living their entire lives in darkness and isolation. The state officials were appalled. The children were removed immediately, placed in institutional care. The adults were evaluated, and those deemed incapable of caring for themselves were also taken into custody. If you are watching this right now and feeling your heart break for these hidden souls who never knew sunlight, leave a comment saying, "No child deserves to live in darkness," Let your voice be heard for those who had no voice. But what to do with the rest of the family? This was a question that would occupy the courts and social services agencies for years to come. Elijah Suttles was among those evaluated. Despite his cognitive limitations and his deteriorating physical condition, he was deemed capable of basic self-care. He was allowed to remain in Rottwood Hollow, along with approximately 20 other family members who met the minimum criteria for independent living, but the community had been irrevocably disrupted. For the first time in 76 years, the Suttles family had been forced to interact with the outside world in a meaningful way. Some of the younger members were placed in foster care, exposed for the first time to life beyond the hollow. A few were enrolled in special education programs where patient teachers attempted to remediate decades of neglect. The results were mixed. Some of the Suttles adapted, learning skills that allowed them to function in society. Others could not overcome the physical and mental barriers that their heritage had imposed upon them. They returned to the hollow, to the only life they had ever known, and the intermarrying continued. Despite the intervention of social services, despite the efforts of Dr. Brennan and others who tried to explain the dangers of their practices, the Suttles could not or would not change. The isolation of generations had created patterns of behavior that were too deeply ingrained to be altered by outside pressure. "We marry our own," one of the elder Suttles told a social worker in 1969. "It's what we've always done. It's what we'll always do." The 1970s brought further decline to Rottwood Hollow. The older generation was dying off, and the younger members who had been exposed to the outside world were increasingly reluctant to return to the life their ancestors had lived. By 1975, the population of the Hollow had dwindled to approximately 15 individuals. Among them was Elijah Suttles, now 43 years old, his hands so damaged that he could barely perform the tasks that had once defined his role in the family. Dr. Brennan, now in his 50s and practicing in a larger clinic in Hazard, continued to visit when he could. He had watched the Suttles family for nearly a quarter century, documenting their decline with a mixture of scientific detachment and genuine sorrow. In the spring of 1976, he arrived at the Hollow to find Elijah sitting alone on the porch of the main house. The building was in even worse repair than before, and Elijah himself seemed diminished, smaller somehow, as if the years had worn away at him like water-eroding stone. "Where is everyone?" Dr. Brennan asked. Elijah looked up with those wandering eyes that had never quite learned to focus. "Gone," he said simply. "They all went away." It took Dr. Brennan some time to piece together what had happened. The previous winter had been harsh, and several of the older family members had died. The younger ones, those who were capable of leaving, had finally done so, drifting away to towns and cities where they hoped to start new lives, to escape the legacy that had defined them from birth. Only Elijah remained, and a handful of others who, like him, had nowhere else to go. Dr. Brennan examined Elijah's hands that day. What he found horrified him. The autoimmune condition had progressed to the point where the tissue was beginning to necrotize. The hands that had carried so many of Elijah's relatives to their graves were now dying themselves, rotting on his living body. "You need to come to the hospital," Dr. Brennan said. "I can't treat this here. You need surgery. Maybe they can save some function." But Elijah shook his head. "This is where I belong," he said. "This is where I'll stay." Dr. Brennan tried to argue, but he knew it was futile. The Suttles had spent generations building walls between themselves and the outside world. Those walls could not be torn down in a single conversation. He left Elijah with what supplies he could spare, promising to return soon. He never saw Elijah alive again. In August of 1976, a hunter passing through the area reported a foul smell coming from Rottwood Hollow. The county sheriff investigated and found what remained of the Suttles community. Elijah Suttles was dead, His body was discovered in the main house, lying on the same straw-filled mattress where Dr. Brennan had first treated his broken arm 24 years earlier. The cause of death was listed as sepsis, a systemic infection that had originated in his hands and spread throughout his body. The hands that carried rot had finally carried him to his own end. 3 other family members were found on the property, all deceased. 2 had died of exposure during the winter. Their bodies had been placed in the root cellar, preserved by the cold, waiting for someone to bury them. But there was no one left to perform that task. The last person capable of handling the dead was Elijah himself, and he had been too ill, too weak to fulfill his final duty. The third body was that of an infant, a child who had apparently been born sometime in the spring and had survived only a few weeks. The cause of death was unclear, but the physical abnormalities were consistent with the Suttles lineage: a malformed heart, a skull too small to accommodate a developing brain. The final generation of the Suttles of Rottwood Hollow had ended as it had begun, in isolation, in tragedy, in the inevitable consequences of a bloodline that had turned in upon itself until there was nothing left to sustain. The story of the Suttles family did not end with Elijah's passing. In the years that followed, researchers and journalists began to piece together the full scope of what had occurred in Rottwood Hollow over the course of nearly a century. Dr. Brennan's notebooks, preserved after his retirement in 1985, provided invaluable documentation. His careful observations, made over decades of visits, painted a picture of a community that had systematically destroyed itself through isolation and endogamy. Geneticists who studied the available records estimated that the Suttles family had experienced what is known as a founder effect, combined with severe genetic bottlenecking. When Ezra Suttles established his homestead in 1891 and decreed that his descendants would marry only among themselves, he set in motion a process that would amplify any genetic weaknesses present in the original population. With each generation, the pool of available genetic material shrank. Recessive alleles that might have remained hidden in a larger, more diverse population were brought together again and again, expressed in the physical and mental abnormalities that became the hallmarks of the Suttles lineage. The hands were particularly significant. Multiple family members across generations exhibited the same distinctive deformity: large, powerful hands with twisted fingers and swollen joints. This was likely the result of a dominant genetic mutation that had been present in one of the original founders, possibly Ezra himself or his wife Hester. In a normal population, such a trait might appear occasionally and then disappear as carriers married individuals without the mutation. But in the closed system of Rottwood Hollow, the mutation had no opportunity to dissipate. It was passed down generation after generation, becoming more prevalent with each iteration. The cognitive impairments were similarly attributed to the concentration of recessive genes. Intelligence is influenced by hundreds or thousands of genetic variants, and inbreeding tends to reduce the diversity of these variants, often resulting in lower cognitive function. The Suttles family demonstrated this principle with devastating clarity. But perhaps the most poignant aspect of the Suttles legacy was what it revealed about human nature and the power of isolation. The Suttles did not set out to destroy themselves. They were responding to forces that seemed beyond their control: the trauma of war, the harshness of life in Appalachia, the suspicion of outsiders that was common throughout the mountain communities of the era. Ezra Suttles believed he was protecting his family by keeping them together, by maintaining their pure bloodline. He could not have known that he was condemning them to a slow, generational extinction. The last known individual with direct ties to the Suttles of Rottwood Hollow passed away in 1998. She was a woman named Clara, one of the children who had been removed during the 1967 intervention and placed in institutional care. She had spent her entire adult life in a state facility, never marrying, never having children of her own. With her death, the direct line ended, but the hollow itself remains. The structures have long since collapsed, reclaimed by the forest that surrounds them. The family cemetery on the hillside is overgrown, the unmarked graves indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. Only the name persists, Rottwood Hollow, a testament to what happened when one family closed its doors to the world and paid the ultimate price for their isolation. The story of the Suttles is not unique. Throughout Appalachia, throughout the world, there are communities that have experienced similar tragedies, bloodlines that have curved back upon themselves until they could no longer sustain human life. The science of genetics has given us the tools to understand why this happens, but understanding alone cannot prevent it. What prevents it is connection, openness, the willingness to reach beyond the familiar, beyond the comfortable, beyond the boundaries that fear and suspicion create. The hands that carried rot were not cursed by God or punished by fate. They were the product of human choices, made over generations, each one building upon the last until the accumulated weight of those choices became too heavy to bear. Let the Suttles be remembered, not as freaks or curiosities, but as human beings who suffered the consequences of isolation taken to its ultimate extreme. Let their story serve as a warning, a reminder that the bonds of family, taken too far, can become chains that drag entire generations into darkness. And let us never forget Elijah Suttles, the man with the powerful, twisted hands who spent his life carrying the dead to their rest, never knowing that he was also carrying the burden of a family's fatal mistake. The hands that carried rot, the bloodline that destroyed itself, the hollow that time forgot. This was the story of the Suttles of Rottwood Hollow, and now you know it too. If you watched until here, it is because this story touched something deep within you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know you and recognize those who truly appreciate the stories shared on this channel. If this story moved you, press the like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who appreciates true stories that reveal the hidden corners of human history. And if you are not yet subscribed, click that subscribe button right now. Every week this channel brings you stories that the world has tried to forget, stories that deserve to be told, stories that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Thank you for watching. Until the next story.